read for you this story and the context of the story. Remember, Jeremiah's preaching to a people who don't listen to him. In fact, he's preaching in opposition to many other people who are saying different things from what he is. And essentially, there's a gag order put on Jeremiah. The people in charge say, we don't want to hear you preaching anymore, Jeremiah, because his message is Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. That's his message. Judgment is coming on the people. And this passage we're reading this morning comes in the middle of that message. Jerusalem will be destroyed, but... So let me read for you Jeremiah chapter 32. Jeremiah 32, beginning in verse 1. I'm going to read the whole chapter, and then we're going to come back and focus on a little bit of it. This is the word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah from the Lord in the 10th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, which was the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar. The army of the king of Babylon was then besieging Jerusalem, and Jeremiah the prophet was confined in the courtyard of the guard in the royal palace of Judah. Now Zedekiah, king of Judah, had imprisoned him there, saying, why do you prophesy as you do? You say, this is what the Lord says, I'm about to hand the city over to the king of Babylon, and he will capture it. Zedekiah, king of Judah, will not escape out of the hands of the Babylonians, but will certainly be handed over to the king of Babylon, and he will speak with him face to face and see him with his own eyes. He will take Zedekiah to Babylon, where he will remain until I deal with him, declares the Lord. If you fight against the Babylonians, you will not succeed. So do you begin to understand why they wanted to keep Jeremiah quiet? Can you imagine your city being under siege and having some well-known prophet going around saying, by the way, guys, just give up. It's over for us. The king is going to be taken captive. God is going to deal with our king. Lay down your arms. Don't fight the enemy. Just give up. Now you can see how tactically the kings and generals of that city would probably want Jeremiah to just shut up and go away, right? That makes sense. So they imprison him in the courtyard of the guard, and yet Jeremiah, his ministry continues. Because it says, Jeremiah said, the word of the Lord came to me, Hanamel, son of Shallum, your uncle is going to come to you and say, buy my field at Anathoth, because as nearest relative it is your right and duty to buy it. Just as the Lord had said to my cousin Hanamel, he came to me in the courtyard of the guard, and he said, buy my field at Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin, since it is your right to redeem it, possess it, buy it for yourself. I knew this was the word of the Lord, and so I bought the field at Anathoth for my cousin Hanamel, and weighed out for him 17 shekels of silver, and I signed and sealed the deed and had it witnessed. And I weighed out the silver on the scales. I took the deed of purchase and the sealed copy containing the terms and conditions, as well as the unsealed copy. And I gave this deed to Baruch, son of Neriah, the son of Mahasiah. Oh, I should have practiced my Hebrew words here, my Hebrew names. Mahasiah. In the presence of I was so busy practicing guitar, I didn't have time for Hebrew this week. I didn't get either of them particularly well, that actually. I did this in the presence of my cousin Hanamel and of the witnesses who had signed the deed of all the Jews sitting in the courtyard of the guard. In their presence I gave Baruch these instructions. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Take these documents, both the sealed and the unsealed copies of the deed of purchase, and put them in a clay jar so that they will last a long time. For this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Houses, fields, vineyards will again be bought in this land. After I have given the deed of purchase to Baruch, son of Neriah, I pray to the Lord, sovereign Lord, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and your outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you. I want to read that again for you. Sovereign Lord, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and your outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you. You show love to thousands, but bring the punishment for the fathers' sins into the laps of their children after them. O great and powerful God, whose name is the Lord Almighty, great are your purposes and mighty are your deeds. Your eyes are open to all the ways of men. You reward everyone according to their conduct and as is his deeds deserve. You performed miraculous signs and wonders in Egypt, and you have continued them to this day, both in Israel and among all mankind. And you have gained the renown that is still yours. You brought your people Israel out of Egypt with signs and wonders, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and with great terror. You gave them this land that you had sworn to give their forefathers, a land flowing with milk and honey. They came in and they took possession of it, but they did not obey you or follow your law. They did not do what you commanded them to do. So you have brought all this disaster upon them. See how siege ramps are built up to take the city. Because of the sword, famine, and plague in the city, it will be handed over to the Babylonians who are attacking it. What you said has happened, as you now see. And though the city will be handed over to the Babylonians, you, O sovereign Lord, say to me, buy the field with silver and have the transaction witnessed. Then the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, I am the Lord, that's Yahweh, the God of all mankind. Which, by the way, is an interesting statement, right? Normally when he says, I am Yahweh, the Lord, who is he the Lord of? Who is he the God of? I am Yahweh, the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Here he says, I am Yahweh, the God of all mankind. Is anything too hard for me? Can I just pause there for a second? I'm going to begin this sermon. My first point of the sermon is going to be a bit of a weird one. But it's important and it's necessary because when we get to the key, you're going to understand why I went over the weird stuff first. Jeremiah earlier in his prayer said, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and your outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you. Nothing is impossible for you. You came to church this morning. There were things today that would have been too hard for you. For example, for those of you who came from the Sioux, if your car had broken down and you had to push it here this morning, that would have been too hard for you, I promise. I'm looking at this congregation right now. I don't see anyone capable of pushing a 2-ton truck from the Sioux to Echo Bay. Okay? And maybe I'm wrong. If you want to meet me in the parking lot afterward for feats of strength, we can do that. All I'm saying there is we as human beings are finite in every respect. There is nothing about you which is not finite. There is a limit to everything about you. And I know some days you feel like maybe our foolishness, maybe that's unlimited, or there are things that we feel like, no, everything about you is finite. Everything. And yet, we go about often talking as if we are somehow great or grand or magnificent. And it's true. There are some amazing things that humans have done and accomplished. But we need to recognize that as creatures of flesh and blood, with short lives and limited intellects, humble faith becomes the only reasonable posture we can have to life in this world. Humble faith is the only reasonable posture we can have in this world, especially when it comes to big questions of life. Now, obviously, I am not an atheist. Maybe that isn't obvious, but I'm standing here preaching from a book that says it came from the God who created the universe. I've devoted my life, years of study, to understanding God and knowing God and teaching others about God. I am amazed to hear people say, I know for a fact there cannot be a God. I'm amazed by that. Not because I think how stubborn, but the fact that you can have such confidence that there is no God just boggles my mind. I was listening to one commentator recently, and he was in a group with a number of atheists, and he said to them, if you're an atheist, please stand up right now. And the question was, how many of you, at some point or another, have gone through periods of doubt about your atheism? And very few of them stood up. Most of them were absolutely confident that they knew that there was no God. And his response to them was, well, do you not realize that that makes you more blind in your faith than most religious people? Because religious people will admit to you having crises of faith. Having crises of faith, right? Where people go through things where they feel like they wonder, am I really believing what's true? is what I believe, is what I'm holding on to. Am I really, is this true? Religious people go through crises of faith. And yet those who claim to be without blind faith never doubt. And personally, reading the books of Scripture, reading what God has given us, and seeing the figures of Christian history and the Hebrew people, most of them go through periods where they have to come to God and say, God, are we sure we've got this right? Remember John the Baptist? Remember he was in prison and he sent his disciples to ask Jesus, Jesus, are you the one we've been waiting for? Or should we be looking for someone else? John the Baptist, whose birth was a miracle, who saw the Spirit of God descend on his cousin and the voice of God speak, this is my son, the one I love. John the Baptist sent to Jesus and said, are you the one we're looking for, or should I be searching for someone else? Did I get it wrong? When you consider how limited we are, humble faith is the only reasonable approach to the big questions of life. So, you want me to demonstrate this? Can you imagine, for a second, if you don't have a dog, pretend that you did. Most of you have met my dog. Can you imagine trying to explain the rules of checkers to a dog? Try. Pretty much impossible, right? They'll eat the checkers. I promise you that. Don't use cookies for checkers, or they definitely will eat the checkers. Can you imagine trying to explain launching a rocket from a launch pad containing parts for a satellite and human beings? Can you imagine explaining how a rocket is launched from a launch pad into outer space and then returns to the Earth and lands safely and the people disembark? Can you imagine explaining that entire process to an ant who can barely think in 3 dimensions? Like, think about what an ant's world consists of, right? It's the top inch of any surface is basically an ant's world, right? They walk on water, not because they're amazing, but because they're not dense enough. They're not heavy enough to break the surface tension of water. Can I tell you something? You have far more in common intellectually with an ant or a dog than with God. Does that make sense? You are finite, he is infinite. The miracle of God's word to me is not that it tells us the truth, and it absolutely does that. The miracle is that it can communicate truth, real, concrete, unchanging truth, to us who are more like ants than like the triune God whose intellect is infinite. That God can be known by us at all is a miracle. And so I am not as amazed that God would expect the ancient peoples to believe that he created the earth in 7 days. I'm not amazed by the fact that he would ask ancient people to get the whole of that concept, a 7-day, 24-hour day. I'm not amazed by that. What I am amazed by is the fact that we tiny, finite, foolish men and women can even begin to understand the very barest, tiniest fraction of what it means for a 3-in-1 God who exists perfectly in community, perfectly content in his own love, in eternity, to at a moment express his perfect love, let there be, and suddenly all of time and space and history and stuff becomes real out of nothing. Like, how am I able to understand any of that? Humble faith just makes sense. And yet at the same time, I think there are things, there are mysteries, there are big questions of life that we can begin to understand them. So for example, one of the classic problems, if you want to call it that for God, is if there is a God who is all-powerful and there's a God who is all-loving, why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? Logically, that is problematic. Because either God is not all powerful and he can't stop the problem, or he is not all loving and he doesn't want to stop the problem, or why do we have pain? Like, it seems like an unsolvable problem. And yet, we can begin to understand that darkness helps us see light clearly. That cold makes us love warmth. That pain can sometimes amplify comfort. Does that make sense to you? I will tell you the best Mr. Noodle I have ever had has been after 4 hours of hiking. Do you understand what I'm saying? Mr. Noodle is not good. I mean, it's okay. It's too salty. There's nothing to it. And you would be amazed how good it tastes after you've been hiking for hours and it's finally something warm to eat. When it comes to pain and suffering in this world, I have often thought, how would God demonstrate how much he loves us if it were just like a children's TV program? You know what I mean by that? Have you ever seen those kids' programs where nothing really goes wrong? Like they lose their ball and then they move the wagon that was put there and there's the ball, and that was as much conflict as we had today, and now we go back and the sun's shining. How does God demonstrate the depth of his love? How do we appreciate the depth of that love? How can we appreciate the love of God for eternity if we have not seen what it cost him, how high a price he's willing to pay to redeem sinners? See, I think the reason that we struggle with this logical problem is just because we can't see broad enough, we can't see a big enough picture, or we don't want to see a big enough picture. Or let me put it this way. Would you be willing to put up with 10 minutes of pain to have a life of pleasure? Would you be willing to put up with 10 minutes of pain to have a life of pleasure? This is going to be an analogy, and it's going to be a poor analogy, but I think it gets the point across. Let's say that you were born into a wealthy family. You were born into a wealthy family. Most of us already can't identify with this metaphor, but pretend. And your parents knew that in order for you to live in appreciation of what you have, you would have to see what poverty looked like. And so your family, when you were 5 years old, said, you're going to go spend a week living in a place where they don't have running water, they don't have all these conveniences, they don't have, forced air heating, you're going to live in the midst of poverty for 1 week, so that when you come back, you can see how well off we are. Now, my first question is there a good reason why parents would want to expose their children to just hypothetically, could you see a reason why a parent would say, I want you to go live for that week? Seeing how some people live. Seeing how things could be. Do you understand the reason the parent might say that? Do you also understand from the perspective of the child why the benefit of that may become exponential as their life goes on? How it doesn't just bear fruit for a short season, but every day of their life, they wake up and they recognize this hot water that I have for my shower, it is a blessing. Instead of complaining that it's 2 degrees off perfect, thank God it's there. So let me extend the analogy now. What if God puts you in this world where sin and darkness, pain and suffering were real for 70 or 80 years, so that for eternity you could sing his praises and know how deep his love ran for you? Would you be willing to live for 70 finite years on this earth so that for eternity you could enjoy God's love? That's a no-brainer bargain for those who actually understand what it means. Now, I know you feel like I've run off on a tangent. I haven't. Because I want to bring you back to the passage that's right in front of us now today and point out, this is the key. This is the key. Here is the key to living at peace with gratitude in light of the year that has been, in contentment with all that's come. And while we face the year that's to come, with hopeful enthusiasm, we can live. The key is this: That we need to have the humility to believe that God will keep his promises even when we cannot rationalize, anticipate, or understand the way things are right now. You need to have the humility to believe that God will keep his promises even when you cannot rationalize, anticipate, or understand the way things are right now. So in the passage we just read, Jeremiah was told, your cousin's going to come visit you. He's going to sell you a field. Jeremiah knows he's been preaching that the city's going to be destroyed. Why would you buy a field in a city that's about to be ransacked? Why would you buy a field in a country that's about to be taken over and the people are going to be carried off into exile? This is a bad investment. On Christmas Eve I talked about, in the Lego movie, one cowboy Lego figure turns to another and he says, do you think Zeppelins are a bad investment? And we as 21st century people know that that's a joke, because of course they're a bad investment. Have any of you ever actually seen a Zeppelin before in real life? Maybe the Goodyear blimp. That's about it. Okay? Investing in land would be the same as investing in Zeppelins. You know there's no future in it. Unless you have the humility to believe that God will keep his promises. So let me read for you from verses 26 and following. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. I am the God of all mankind. Is anything too hard for me? Therefore, this is what the Lord says. I am about to give this city in the hands of the Babylonians, and to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who will capture it. The Babylonians who are attacking the city will come and set it on fire. They will burn it down, along with the houses where the people aroused my anger by burning incense on the roofs to Baal and by pouring out drink offerings to other gods. The people of Israel and Judah have done nothing but evil in my sight from their youth. Indeed, the people of Israel have done nothing but arouse my anger with all that their hands have made. This declares the Lord. From the day it was built until now, the city has so aroused my anger and wrath that I must remove it from my sight. The people of Israel and Judah have provoked me by all the evil they have done. They, their kings and their officials, their priests and their prophets, the people of Judah and those living in Jerusalem. They turned their backs to me and not their faces, though I taught them again and again. They would not listen. They would not respond to discipline. They set up their vile images in the house that bears my name, and they defiled it. They built high places for Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom to sacrifice their sons and daughters to Molech, though I never commanded, nor did it even enter my mind that they should do such a detestable thing, and so make Judah sin. You are saying this about the city. By the sword and famine and plague it will be given to the hands of the king of Babylon. But this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. So I want you to focus in right now. Okay? God has already said the destruction of Judah is assured. And it has to be because of who I am and who you have been. This must happen. But, and I want to point out to you a number of things, and I want you to listen as I read for what God is promising here. And what he is calling Jeremiah to do by buying this land is he is calling Jeremiah to humbly believe that God will do what he said he will do. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I will surely gather them from all the lands where I banished them in my furious anger and great wrath. I will bring them back to this place and let them live in safety. They will be my people, and I will be their God. I will give them singleness of heart and action, so that they will always fear me in all that they do, and then it will go well for them and for their children after them. I will make an everlasting covenant with them. I will never stop doing good for them, and I will inspire them to fear me, so that they will never turn away from me. I will rejoice in doing them good, and will assuredly plant them in this land with all my heart and soul. This is what the Lord says. As I have brought all this great calamity on this people, so I will give them all the prosperity I have promised to them. Once more fields will be bought in this land, of which you say it is a desolate waste, without people or animals, for it has been given to the hands of the Babylonians. Fields will be bought for silver, and deeds will be signed and sealed and witnessed in the territory of Benjamin, in the villages around Jerusalem, in the towns of Judah, and in the towns of the hill country, the western foothills and of the Negev, because I will restore their fortunes, declares the Lord. So here are the promises that God is making, and he makes them to you today, just as he made them to Jeremiah then. And remember our key. Have faith that the one who promised is faithful. I have 4 promises for you as you look back on the year that was, so that you can have contentment, you can have peace. And as we look at the year that is to come, that you can have enthusiasm and hope. Here are the promises. First, verse 37. God has promised to restore that which is broken or lost. God has promised he will restore that which is broken and lost. Surely I will gather them from all the lands where I banished them in my furious anger and great wrath. I will bring them back to this place and let them live in safety. What has been broken? What have you lost? God's promises, he will restore. So the one who has promised is faithful. Here's one that I think is underrated, and yet for our day is so incredibly timely. Verse 39, I will give them singleness of heart and action. God has promised to reconcile and unite. I want you to think about that for our world today, right now. For your life, right now. God has promised to reconcile and unite. Can you imagine what it would be like if your family was reconciled and united? Can you imagine what it would be like if our communities were reconciled and united? God says they will always fear me, and that it will go well for them and their children after them. Can you imagine what it would mean to live in a world where people did not fight and bite and bicker and kill with their words, but we were united and we always did what was right? That is what God has promised he will do. And the one who promised is faithful. What he's calling us to do is have the humility to believe him, that he will keep his promises. Even when I go onto Facebook and YouTube and TikTok, and it looks like, how could anyone unite these people? God will do it. And yes, it may mean some are standing on the outside looking in, but in heaven, in eternity, for those who put their trust in him, we will no longer deal with people red-faced screaming at one another. We will instead turn our faces toward the throne and sing one song of joy. God has promised to reconcile and unite. Hear that promise. Write it down somewhere, because I promise you this week it will mean something to you. Number 3, I will make an everlasting covenant, he says in verse 40, with them. I will never stop doing good to them, and I will inspire them to fear me, so that they will never turn away from me. God has promised to shepherd and to teach. Again, I think an underrated one in a world like today's world. When was the last time you were asked to make a choice and you had no idea what the right choice was? I can promise you there's an election coming sometime. Right? Did you not feel like going to the polls a lot? And again, not to get political, but I talked to an awful lot of people who went into the polling booth saying, I don't think there's a right answer today. I'm going to choose the least worst answer that I can find today. Can you imagine what it would be to have a shepherd who walks with us, who leads us, who never stops doing good for us, who inspires us to fear him? that we never have to turn away. We never want to turn away. We follow the Good Shepherd, and he is a good shepherd to us. Finally, number 4 in verse 42. As I have brought all this great calamity on the people, so I will also give them prosperity, the prosperity I have promised. Again, he picks it up in verse 44. I will restore their fortunes. God has promised that every sorrow, every evil, every darkness will ultimately serve to bring a higher good, a deeper joy, and inextinguishable light.
You need to repeat that one.
I'll repeat it for you. It's a good thing I wrote it down, or I'd never be able to get anything again. He says, so I will give them all the prosperity I have promised them. I will restore their fortunes. God has promised that every evil, every sorrow, and every darkness, so I used a unit of 3 there. Watch, because it's going to be mirrored in a second, okay? Every evil, every sorrow, every darkness will ultimately serve by his grace to bring a higher good. Every evil will bring a higher good. Every sorrow, will bring a deeper joy. And every darkness will bring an inextinguishable light. That's his promise. He said, just as I have brought the calamity. He doesn't deny the calamity, and he says the calamity came from me, but it was purposeful. And just as I brought that, so too will I bring the restoration. And the result of the whole thing is that he will purchase a people for himself, a people who are for his glory. We're going to see that next week. And we will sing the praises of him who did what? Who brought us out of darkness and into his wonderful light. We're gathering around the communion table today, the Eucharist, the Thanksgiving meal. And I want to point out to you that this is primarily what the communion table is about. Jesus says, this is my body, which is for you. It's a demonstration. This is God's love for you. This is how deep it runs. This is how far he will go to redeem you. This is my body, which is for you. And what does he say of the cup? This cup is the new covenant, the promise of God in my blood. An unbreakable promise. And it's already been poured out for us. This is a historic thing. It's not some future promise. I think sometimes people talk about faith as if it were pie in the sky, right? We don't really know if God's going to come through. No, we do know he has come through. We're just waiting for the fullness of it now. And so we gather around the table. And we say, yes, he's here. He's come. And now we wait for him to come again. We proclaim his death until he comes. But as we approach the table, I want to actually isolate verse 41, just in preparation to come to the table. Because I think sometimes getting my own heart and mind right for the table is a challenge. And I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand on this one. I'm not going to ask you to reply to me verbally or audibly. But I am going to ask a rhetorical question of you. Have you ever bargained with God? I think we have. I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I think that'd be a fairly safe bet. At least one other person in here has bargained with God sometime in their life. You're facing some challenge, something you're worried about, maybe something you've done that you don't want to have to face the consequences. Maybe I'm getting a little too close to home on that one. Maybe you've done something you don't want to face the consequences, and you pray, God, if only you could make this not happen, I will be a different person for the rest of my life. Anyone ever said that before? Again, don't put your hands up. Don't need that on the video. What is God demanding of you? What do you need to do to convince him to do all of this for you? Verse 41. Listen to what it says in verse 41. I will rejoice in doing them good, and I will assuredly plant them in this land with all my heart and soul. All my heart and soul. Who's saying that? God. I will rejoice in doing them good, and will assuredly plant them in this land with all my heart and soul. What do you need to do to convince God to do all this for you? What sort of bargain do you need to strike with God? So that's the problem with bargaining with God. It's meaningless. He says, that's exactly, I want to be gracious to you. With all my heart, I want to give you every good thing I have. And the reason we bargain with God is because we somehow still think we have something to offer. God, if only you will do this for me, what's the other half? I will do something for you. That's why bargaining with God is futile. He says, I already want to give you this stuff. You know what's standing in the way? You. He will do it because it is what he longs to do. He rejoices in showing love and grace and redemption. The question is, will you receive it on his terms? As we come to the table, the question isn't, are you good enough to approach? That question's been answered. No, you're not. If you were good enough, Jesus would not have to come. If you were good enough, we wouldn't need the table. We come because by his grace, he has welcomed us home anyhow. If you heard these promises this morning and they sound too good to be true, they're not. They're waiting for you. For those of us with the faith who says, okay, it doesn't look like it right now, but I know the one who promised is faithful. I know, regardless what's going on here and now, regardless of what was behind me, regardless of what I fear ahead of me, God is good always. I will wait to see his grace